Hello everyone, today we talk briefly of the painful events of 1918-1920 Ukraine, right? A time of war defeats, plural, and however still of rise of nationalism, of the independence instances and achievements, in part as a matter of fact. A very delicate situation. So we have looked in the previous videos how the hopes of the Galician Ukrainians were for a national recompaction, in fact, of Galicia and thus of the most important city in the land that would become, in fact, the capital of the Ukrainian National Republic in 1918, Lviv in Polish, Lemberg in German, etc., that had been historically populated by an important amount of Poles, of Jews, and that thus had, properly as a city environment, very different from the rest of the country that was demographically overwhelmingly peasantry, represented also this kind of divide with the fact that it wasn't really prevalently Ukrainian in nature. And in times of war, of revolution, these tensions were exacerbated, and they would be evident, sadly, in such context. There was an important position from which Ukraine was claiming independence. In fact, of the various countries that had been prevalently under Russia, because we're talking mainly about Galicia, but the majority of Ukrainians, in the tens of millions, were in Russia, let's say, or better, under the Tsarist and eventually Soviet rule, and thus, if you just look at the numbers, you realize that they were kind of much more advantaged in this context than other nationalities seeking for independence from Russian domination, such as Lithuania, for example. The Lithuanians were simply less. Lithuania was a smaller country, yet Ukraine managed to score less. After World War I, in the years probably between 1918 and 1920, the German army was de facto protecting Lithuania from the Russians. That basically the Tsarist Empire bailed out of the war in 1917 because of the revolution, also the dramatic situation. The Germans exploited this. They advanced, reaching far in the east, in the heart of Russia, closing to St. Petersburg and so on, and and thus, this northern area that also encompassed Lithuania had been sheltered somewhat by the Germans first and by the Poles later, because as we've seen also in the Polish-Bolshevik War, Vilnius was practically occupied. It was occupied by both, right? Initially, the Red Army had occupied it. Talking about the Polish offensive, also waged against the Soviet Union together with Ukrainians. Then the Soviets had pushed back the invasion to Warsaw. At Warsaw, the Poles defeated the Red Army, which retreated back. And by the time of the peace negotiations, because at that point the two countries were exhausted, and they wouldn't be at war until, in fact, 1939, when the Soviets attacked Poland together with the Nazis. Lithuania at that point, during negotiations, Vilnius specifically, was occupied by the Red Army, and the Soviets didn't have properly, they were not in the condition to claim suzerainty over it, but for this reason they didn't want Vilnius to fall in Polish hands, but they would have liked to give it properly to Lithuanian country. At that point, the the Polish army faked a mutiny during the negotiations and went on and occupied Vilnius, and so that was reincorporated in a Polish rule, because the Poles, as we've seen, were fundamentally looking at all the countries that the Polish kingdom before the partitions had managed fundamentally to dominate, right? And within the Commonwealth, that was a Polish-Lithuanian one, but fundamentally ruled by the Poles. And in this regard, Lithuania was kind of lucky, right? Because relatively a few Lithuanians died in the process. Ukraine had instead, in these years, was tormented by the First World War, the Russian revolutions, and the Russian Civil War, and all the factions that were operating within the same Ukraine, of the same Ukrainians. It was the Etmanate, there were the anarchists. It was a mess fundamentally. We will look at that at some point in detail, hopefully. It lost, to make a long story short, more than 1 million inhabitants, right? We're talking about dead, right? More than 1 million dead in wars that were, as we were just saying, quite complicated. They were sometimes just internal wars, partisan actions, banditry, to pogroms, by the way. So there was basically the full spectrum of all the possible violence and motivations. And the reason being essentially, in great part, if you think about it, the fact that Ukraine up to that point had not been properly a state. So the unity, the cohesion required to carry out successfully a struggle for independence was nullified by the weakness of the administration and the objective lack of time and resources to put things together. Things could have gone differently, because as you know, the civil war just in Russia could have gone differently, etc. But it is obvious that Ukrainians expected more and got less within these populations. It was really mostly about, well, Poland was kind of more obvious to well, okay, it could be destroyed too by the Red Army, as the battle wars have somewhat showed. But the main countries that still didn't have, that were expected in a way to fall into still the Russian orbit in some way, were in fact Lithuania and Ukraine. Lithuania made it. Ukraine was bigger, more populous, etc. did it. And what is terrifying about what happened in Ukraine in those years is that every single part of its land was fundamentally involved, ravaged, simply because there was, aside from Ukrainian, political action, resistance, struggle for independence, etc., probably an enormous interest from every actor in the international scene in the region to regard Ukraine as fundamentally a territory of their own. We're talking about the Poles, the White Russians, the same Bolsheviks, right? Everybody said, this is mine. Because in a way or another, these territories, as we've seen, had fallen either under Poland historically or Russia, also more recently. So there was also a debate among the states of the Entente regarding the fate of Galicia and Volhynia, that were, as we've seen, this and are, by the way, these territories in the northwest of Ukraine. Also partly, yes, it goes also across the borders of Belarus and Poland, etc. historically. But these were obviously, as frontier lands, the more contended by these states. And so the Allies in World War I, and during the continuation with the Russian Revolution and the Civil War, etc., disagreed fundamentally on whom these lands had to go to, right? And what is relevant is that none of them envisaged, so we're talking about the victorious states, right, of the war, a Ukrainian statehood, or they wouldn't consider properly even any Ukrainian claim seriously in the process. So the expectation of the creation of a Ukrainian state wouldn't come from the West. And if you consider what was going on altogether, of course, it was a much bigger plan that involved at that point in 1918, 1920 to defeat or at least contain Bolshevik Russia. So there was initially an Entente support to General Anton Denikin, white Russian general who was fighting against the Bolsheviks in Ukraine, but he was a Russian nationalist who therefore considered Ukraine to be part of the Russia that would have come, also under a white government. But Denikin, famously enough, was defeated. So at that point, the other major player they supported to retain control of Ukraine was Poland, which, as we've seen, was in fact literally undertook an invasion of the Soviets, and such support implied unavoidably that essentially the whole Galicia, so also the one that was differently from the Western one was by majority Ukrainian, right? Whereas the West was historically more prevalently Polish, would go in fact to Poland as a consequence, and thus that Lviv would be part of the Polish state, of the Second Polish Republic. So there were two states founded by the Ukrainians after World War I, one in Lviv, the other in Kiev. And just by, as you understand from the map, one had, and we just said it, met with essentially Polish opposition, the other with the Russian one. And these states, as we've seen, didn't have allies fundamentally. So they both crumbled. And for the aforementioned reasons, the Ukrainian elites were in deep difficulty. They didn't have an immediate statal availability fundamentally. They had to reorganize everything from scratch, and there was like modern countries had to be built now with some important institutional, administrative, industrial capacities. As we've seen, these were prevalently agricultural lands, and so also the capitals that were expression of urban cultures were fundamentally detached from the peasantry. And as we've seen in the case of Lviv and Kiev, also they were prevalently and historically not even Ukrainian in cultural identity. They were more Polish than else. Worse than that, the same Ukrainian elites were divided, right? And there is nothing worse, especially to win a war, when you are divided and crippled by weakness, right? Of even just aside from the lack of an army, of the difficulty of spreading information among the peasantry. These were quite practical needs, right? But it was properly the control on the land. It was precarious, in fact, that there were many, not just external threats, but also internal ones, because there were many elements that fundamentally just were in opposition to the institutions that were created at that point. This was particularly true for Kiev. The Western Ukrainian Republic in Lviv was somewhat more successful. There was this dramatic autumn in 1918 when the Ukrainians took over the places of power in Lviv on the night of October 31st, 1918. And then there was the counterattack of the Polish residents the day after. And still, however, the intervention of the Polish regular army crushed Galician Ukrainian resistance there. In particular, there's this figure, General Joseph Haller, that was essentially a Polish, right? But was guiding at that point essentially an army from France. He was an exile. He had fought many wars and was called in April 1919 to crush the Ukrainian opposition. And his troops were driven east beyond the Zbruch River, right? And so the Ukrainian Republic was effectively defeated by July 1919. The Ukrainian government fled in exile to Vienna, by the way. This costed 15,000 Galician Ukrainian men. It also created a generation of frustrated veterans that at that point saw uncompromisingly Poland as an enemy of the Ukrainian national cause, and they considered that these people had been fighting not just for their country but also during World War I, like hoping that any participation to it, either from the Austrian or the Russian side, would have brought to any benefit for their independence. So these were not just conscripts or volunteers or recruits of any sort. They were people who had already fought and died for, and they knew how to, for their country. So the war brought Lvov, and all eastern Galicia within Poland, the new Polish state established after World War I. Thus, this made 3 million Ukrainian speakers at least, and just a bit less of 1 million Galician Jews, citizens of the Second Polish Republic. As we have seen in the previous video, this was not really especially good news for the Jews specifically, as the Polish army in these circumstances saw the Jewish neutrality or self-defense as a support of Ukraine, which, independently from whatever the local Jews were, let's say, more advantaged in doing, like was not really reciprocated wholeheartedly by Ukrainians that considered the Jews in the country just like a sort of external presence brought historically by the Poles, the Germans, etc. So there was between 1918 and 1919 in Lvov the killing of at least 70 Jews at the hands of the Poles. The First World War brought to naturally a new era that was soundly based now in countries that historically had not been part of the main, at least the main revolutionary movements at least in a narrowly Western statal tradition, like it could happen in, I don't know, in France or Italy or even Germany in part. And so there was, for the first time, the opportunity to create a national statal identity on the ashes of the old empires. So as we've seen, Warsaw came to incorporate Lviv, while Kiev would fall under the Soviet Union. So this was, we'll look at it in detail, but it was definitely a moment of great frustration for Ukrainians. The Habsburgs, especially as we've seen in Galicia, had deeply motivated Ukrainian speakers to dream properly a state building on their own, right, within political and institutional structures that were very different from the ones of the Tsarist Empire, and that thus had provided Ukrainians, in fact, with more potential of properly self-awareness, of state building capacity, civic education, democratic culture, and so on. There was also another important event, that is the one of the Lemkos. The Lemkos are an Eastern Slavic population inhabiting the hills at the time the Polish-Czechoslovak border. So yes, Eastern Europeans, but close to also a particular Central European reality. There were at the time, they were speaking of Galicia, of course, but it was from the Ukrainian side. The Galicia counted, as we have seen, 3 million people, and the Lemkos were something around 150,000, so not a few. And these people were fundamentally Russophiles, not because they care, at least their elites, not because they wanted to be under Russian government, but because they didn't want to be under somebody else's government, either Polish or Ukrainian. They lived effectively in the Beskidi ranges of the Carpathian Mountains. They were quite isolated, right? Even from Ukrainian ideas, right? They lived properly in communities on their own. So they rose, right, in November 1918, when the Galician Ukrainians declared the independence in Lviv. In November 1918, when the West Ukrainian Republic was created, the Lemkos fell fundamentally under the latter's administration. That's where they petitioned to be annexated by Russia. And at that point, what would happen later on is that in spring 1920, the Lemkos were suppressed by the Polish army, who intervened and secured these lands in now the, as we've seen, occupied Galicia. This was particularly important because it, in a sense, it shows how, aside from nationalism in, being bred during the decline of the Habsburgic Empire, for obvious reasons, because in part the Austrians, from more authoritarian and repressive, they bought in pan-Germanism, which traditionally was something the Habsburgs detested, because of course, if anything, they had been fighting against Prussia during what effectively would lead to the German unification, of which the empire was left out. And the other nationalities began to push for more representation after 1866. The year after was properly the elevation of Hungary to the same level of Austria in the empire, and began also Hungarian repression began of other minorities around. So the Lemkos case is interesting because let's say they represented, per se, aside from the allegiance, because new countries were formed at this point, from the Habsburgic Empire, like Austria remained within itself. There was Hungary, Czechoslovakia, etc. And so the Lemkos are a sort of relic of that older federalist tradition of that. Of course, they were a minority, so it's not that they would have probably pursued national independence on their own, but it shows that certain areas of Galicia had, however, not been completely involved in the struggle for Ukrainian national independence, which again is understandable. In fact, what is fascinating, I think, of this whole scenario, and we're really skipping so many things because the whole matter is incredibly more complicated than this, but it's the brutality of the passage from essentially an ancien regime to the most ferocious forms of statalism. I mean, think about the Soviet Union. And so radically different ideologies that began to enforce also with a dramatically renewed statal power themselves locally, and brought to all the changes and the frustrations and the massacres, as we've seen, for ethnic reasons and enmities that we know. But it's important to stress that this was barely, like, it was fundamentally just 100 years ago, that before, which is an incredibly short time, before that, a completely different world, especially in these countries in Central and Eastern Europe, was there. It's as if, you know, the word of tradition, the word that we have seen, even of the common law, right? Not of the state as the source, single source of law, etc., was still leaving, right? With a relatively peaceful ethnic coexistence, among different cultures and so on. And yes, it is true that evidently the empires that crumbled after World War I, crumbled not just for a mere military chance, right? They crumbled because everything is political, and of course they had become somewhat anachronistic. They had made their time, right? They probably crumbled under the push of this independence struggles by the side of, as we've seen in the case of Ukrainians, even of tens of millions of people who regarded themselves to be wanted to be free, right? Not to be under a dynasty, because that was mostly the mentality at the time. They wanted something else. This is not to say to comment from us to say whether this was a positive or a negative thing, but the history of modernity must be carefully studied, because I am a medievalist, so I tend to have this, of course, this appreciation towards a world that was not so rigidly organized like our own, also in terms of statal allegiances and juridical inflexibility in a sense. But it's important to stress also why this happened and how, of course, we dramatically benefited from it in so many other levels, right? So it's possible to make different things coexist, and there are, however, deeper motives why such different forms of government emerge, right? That, again, I don't think they're positive altogether. I think they are negative, as a matter of fact, especially as far as the individual is come to, is under examination, but that from a collective point of view at least have saved what would have otherwise probably would have failed altogether on all levels. And this is, I'm being cryptic about this now, but we will talk about it, because I have something, an idea that I'm developing from 1 year to this time, that at least I substantiated more. But we'll keep talking about these times, these places, and get a bit more in depth about other things. So for now, we'll stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. I wish you a nice time, and see you next time. Bye.